Welcome. Welcome to the 75th anniversary Polk Seminar on Journalism in an Age of Disinformation, Digital Media, and AI. I'm Ralph Engelman, Faculty Coordinator of the George Polk Awards. Recognition of Polk laureates earlier today at the Polk Awards luncheon prompted us to look backward and consider journalism history. This seminar prompts us to look forward to the challenges and opportunities today's reporters and news organizations face. There's much to unpack. A few quick thank yous to the Polk Committee, that largely anonymous body that is the heart and soul of the Polk Project, to LIU President Kimberly Klein and her truly extraordinary team, and to the Center for Communication, our partners in the Polk seminars for over 3 decades. Our moderator is Dick Tofel, founding general manager and former president of ProPublica, currently the author of the newsletter Second Rough Draft, Journalism in Our Time.
Come on. Is this working? Great, excellent. Sit down, gang. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon. It is a true honor to be here today in the company of giants, both in the audience with our honorees from lunch and particularly on this panel. I want to thank John Darton for asking me to be here today and for giving me this privilege. Bob Woodward was supposed to be able to join us today, but in the end could not. I suspect there are very few people here today who do not know the panelists, but for those few, here are a few highlights. Let me start. Closest to me, Julie Pace is the executive editor of the Associated Press, where she has spent almost her entire career. She was named to her current role in 2021. Christiane Amanpour is chief international anchor for CNN and also hosts a show on PBS. She has also worked over the years at CBS News and ABC News. Marty Barron is the former executive editor of the Washington Post and earlier editor of the Boston Globe and executive editor of the Miami Herald. He is also the author of the recent memoir, Collision of Power, about the Post in the Trump years. Christiane, Dean, and Marty, Dean.
Skip Dean.
Yeah, you skipped me. That's okay.
No, I was going, sorry. The order was different here. Dean Baquet is the former executive editor of the New York Times and also former editor of the Los Angeles Times. These days, he leads the Times Local Investigations Fellowship. So, Christiane, Dean, and Marty were all among the 16 career Polk laureates honored earlier today. Julie, who is a generation younger, will, I can confidently predict, be in the laureate group for the Polk's 100th anniversary.
No pressure.
No, I think it's already...
We look good for 100.
Already baked.
Great to remind us of our age. That's fantastic. Yes.
As I told the panel some time ago that I want to start by asking each of you briefly to say what was the most important thing in journalism that you think has changed for the better since the beginning of your career, and the thing that has changed for the worse that most concerns you. I'm going to do this in the order of who's had the chance to see the most in terms of time. So, Marty, I'm sorry.
It's like the second reminder of my age. My God, how many times is this going to happen tonight?
But that's, so we'll start with Marty, and then Dean, and then Christiane, and then Julie.
Yeah.
I think slowly, so I'll speak slowly. There you go.
The good news, by the way, is Marty's a minute older than I am, but I'm actually older than everybody else. So go ahead.
All right. In any event, I would say the same thing, actually, for both the internet. So I think in terms of the good things that have happened with the internet is that it has allowed us a tremendous number of tools that we never had before that we can use that are incredibly powerful storytelling tools. And certainly those of us who come from legacy newspapers never had those kinds of the opportunities to disseminate information and tell stories in those ways. It also allowed a lot of people to have a voice who previously didn't have a voice and weren't being listened to. And it allowed a tremendous amount of access to experts who perhaps were just not being called upon, and it allowed us to disseminate our information to an enormous number of people that we couldn't before. And then on the downside, and it's a significant downside, the internet. And that is that it has allowed the spread of enormous number of so-called media outlets or outlets of one sort or another that are spreading misinformation, disinformation, outright conspiracy theories, such that today we have no shared set of facts in our societies today. And it's worse than that. We can't even agree on how to establish that something is a fact. What are the elements that we need in order to establish something as a fact? And so that is a potentially catastrophic danger to society as a whole, certainly to democracy, of course to the press, but society and democracy are bigger than the press.
So if you give the same answer to two different questions, you get the following follow-up. Net them out, positive, net them out, net the internet, minus the internet, up or down?
Well, there's nothing we can do about it. So it's like we're living with it and we make the best of it. But I would say that it has not been generally unhelpful, I think, to society.
Generally unhelpful.
What's that?
Generally unhelpful.
Unhelpful to democracy and to sort of societal progress.
Dean.
I would say for the good, technology in general, and which includes the internet. But also, when I was an investigative reporter for the Times, if I wanted to, in fact, I did, look at land deals in New York, I had to go to all 5 boroughs. It took 5 days. I sit down with a reporter for the Times now, and Eric Lipton, he does it in an hour. Writing is better because of technology. Reach is greater. The New York Times would never have been able to have 10 subscribers before. So I would say in general, technology has made visual investigations, technology has made journalism significantly better. And I would say the thing that gives me the most concern is the decline of local journalism. Because it means, first off, selfishly, there's not a group of young journalists who are being trained to one day work for our institutions. Secondly, there are entire swaths of America that have no local coverage, no school board coverage. Members of Congress are pretty much covered as national figures. Nobody's got I'm sure the Arkansas papers don't have anybody covering the Arkansas delegation. So the actual nitty-gritty coverage, whether it's local congressmen or school boards, or the stuff that newspapers used to be able to do, and mostly newspapers, in their heyday, my biggest fear is the disappearance of that, which has already, frankly, disappeared.
Christiane.
So I speak as a correspondent and not as an executive, and I speak as a foreigner, which is different to what Americans probably feel and see and operate in. And I speak as a foreign correspondent. So I'm going to say that for me, in my existence, Ted Turner and the creation of 24/7 CNN Revolution, which revolutionized the media landscape, was a huge positive. And I say that because what he tried to do and what he did was democratize information, particularly around the world, because around the world, and I can attest to it because I lived there, information was pretty much state-run, whether it's television, print, whatever it was, radio. When you live in non-democracies, you don't have a free information, method. So when CNN International became a thing, it really had a massive impact on the whole world, and I thought that was really great. I do believe, though, that, and I do think everything in 24/7 is simply a copy of what TED started. And it doesn't mean to say that imitation has been, great, because actually I feel it's got progressively worse. And I believe that Ted Turner is somebody who was so, absolutely firm about his mission and about his belief and about his commitment. And he wasn't there just to make money. Of course, he was a businessman, but he had ideals, he had a mission, and we believed in that mission and we followed the leader, essentially. And I think that in the, 40 odd years since CNN was created, June 1980, 44 years, the technology at once has helped us exponentially, deliver the message. But as these gentlemen have said, it has also divided us. It has forced us into partisan and political corners because of the different kinds of 24/7 and other outlets that have developed. It hasn't made us, more inclusive. It's done the opposite. And I think, and that's all over the world, journalists all over the world today are pushed into corners. And that's terrible. And I also think that I don't actually agree anymore at this particular time that 24/7 is constructive. Because what it means is that you're trying to fill 24/7, and usually it's with a lot of combat, because combat sells. And I believe in trying to get people together and get information together rather than being a vehicle for a lot of fighting. And I also believe that the lack of local news is a big problem, and it's all over the world, not just here.
Is it just that it sells, by the way? I mean, it strikes me, and I'm just one viewer, but that 24/7 television, for instance, is at its very best when the news is at its most extreme, right? And everybody
no, not extreme.
Well,
at its most breaking.
Unexpected, dramatic, that's what I mean, by extreme. The highest note on the scale in terms of news. But of course, news isn't like that most of the time.
Right.
And so by the nature of 24/7, don't you have to fill much of it most of the time with opinion? Because
you don't have to.
Opinion is limitless?
No, you don't have to. You can do many, many cycles of actual fact-based news. You do not have to fill it with opinion. People have decided to fill it with opinion. You don't have to. We have so many reporters. We have so many field crews. We deliver really wonderful reports from all over the world. And that could also fill. I think there's a place for opinion, but I don't think just because it's 24/7 it has to be majority opinion. And I will also say that I think one of the most terrible things is the proliferation of fake news, which has not only compromised the truth, but has compromised trust in us. And as people are trying to figure out where do we turn for actual facts and for trustworthy information, and I think fake news is a big, I don't think, it's a huge enemy, not just for us in the media, but also in politics. And we can talk about what's happening in Congress with the Ukraine bill, for instance.
Okay, Julie, best and worst.
Well, maybe in an attempt to end this section on a positive, I'll start with my worst first. I would say, and this echoes some of what you've heard already, I would say that the pressures on the business models in local news have really deprived a lot of young journalists of the opportunity to do certainly the kind of journalism training that I got to do. I think often about the opportunity to make mistakes on a small scale, right? The opportunity to do that when I was the reporter in the Northwest Hillsborough County section of the Tampa Tribune, which is now closed, as opposed to doing it at a big news organization in New York or Washington. The opportunity to be really connected to a community, to understand really directly the impact that your journalism has on your audience and what the audience is responding to because you are living and working in that community. On the flip side, I think that the pressures of the business have created some really interesting and exciting opportunities for journalists to be entrepreneurial, to experiment, to try new things. And while I think we are living in this period of time where you may see it get worse before it gets better, I think there are a lot of exciting things out there, and it's because of journalists kind of taking the reins themselves and saying, I'm gonna try this in a different way. I'm gonna try to break through some of these business models that are failing, frankly. And I think we will get to the other side of it. I wish I had the secret to how that's gonna happen. But I think that entrepreneurial spirit is a really positive for a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Okay, before we move on, anybody want to react to anything anybody has already said? Okay.
All very wise.
Yeah. So I'd like to try some historical pairings from earlier in your career for each of you and and today's news. Marty, could I ask you to compare covering the election disputes of 2000 and 2020, both of which you did?
Yeah, I was the editor of the Miami Herald during the 2000 presidential election. Obviously, that election hinged on the result in Florida. The vote count, the difference was 537 votes in the state of Florida. So to make a long story short, Gore asked for a recount. There was the beginnings of one. It went to the Florida Supreme Court, which ruled that there should be a recount. Then it went to the US Supreme Court, which ruled that there wouldn't be a recount. The result was Al Gore accepted the decision of the Supreme Court. He graciously conceded, and the country moved on. And he asked the country to support the new president of George W. Bush. Now, we at the Miami Herald, we did something to actually say, well, we'll do our own recount. And it was great because Florida has such an expansive public records law that we were able to, we argued in courts throughout all 67 counties of Florida that every ballot was a public record and that we should be entitled to see it. And together with an accounting firm, we each independently did the accounting firm was BDO Seidman. We did our independent counts and came to the conclusion actually that George W. Bush most likely did win that election, but by a very small margin. Both we and the accounting firm came to that conclusion.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
This is great. I'm just sort of wondering, we're in New York City, and I'm interested to take sort of a quick audience poll. How many people who have a view, you don't have to have a view, believe that George W. Bush actually won the election in Florida? Raise your hands, please. And how many people, well, no, I've let you, and how many people think Al Gore won the election in Florida?
Well, you're wrong.
So, and for those who can't see,
By the way,
it's about evenly split. So,
by the way, there was an alliance of the Associated Press, with New York Times, the Washington Post, a bunch of other media outlets. They did their own count, and they came to essentially the same result. So I recommend everybody go back and actually look at the facts and the recount. It would be something that it would be advisable for those who doubt the results of the 2020 election and those who doubt the results of the 2000 election, but just from different ideological perspectives. And I think our job, I mean, look, we were accused by the GOP at the time when they got wind that we were doing this recount, that we were accused of trying to delegitimize the Bush presidency. That's not what we were doing. We were trying to find out, for the sake of history and for the sake of the American public, what really was the count. That was that was the result, and that's what we reported. And we reported on votes that were legitimately cast and that you could legitimately count as votes in any election, the way that a recount would have been done. So. And then, of course, in 20 years later, we were faced with another challenge to the election. Donald Trump was challenging the election before the election was even held. He was arguing that it would be rigged right from the beginning. He argued that for months and months and months. And sure enough, and it was predicted that night he would challenge it before all of the ballots were in, all of the absentee ballots were in. And sure enough, that's exactly what he did, because he could claim that the absentee ballots were somehow fraudulent. There was some fraudulent activity on that. And of course, to this day, of course, he hasn't accepted the results of the election, and his supporters haven't accepted the results of the election. But that too has been put to the test. It's been put to the test in courts. There have been, 60 plus, I don't know what the number is anymore, 60 plus challenges in the courts. And those have been, he hasn't won, I think he won on one small matter, that's it. But nothing of any consequence. And those are the results. And, if somebody challenges an election, you say, fine, you want to challenge it, what's your proof? You got proof? Present it in court. He did present it in court. He lost over and over and over again. And the same thing with the 2000 election. We actually went back, others went back and actually looked at those ballots, and we came up with the result that George Bush most likely won by a very small margin.
Yeah, and by the way...
Sorry to disappoint so many people here. I really apologize, but them's the facts.
I was working at the Wall Street Journal at that point, and we were involved in this effort, and we reached exactly the same conclusion.
That's right.
That you laid out. What does it say, what is the contrast between these two things, which is, so maybe even here, more people actually, in retrospect, think that the person who ended up clearly losing won, but the country moved on. It was not riven in the period 2000 to 2004 by this election. Today it is. Does that say, it says a lot about our politics for sure. What does it say about journalism to you and the changes in journalism in the intervening period? Anything?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have quite the sway that we did at one time. I mean, the reality is that people are getting information from all sorts of different sources. There are journalism today and media generally is much more fragmented than it was at the time in 2000. And so people can find any outlet that confirms or affirms their pre-existing point of view or what their leader tells them is the truth. And, you know, Trump spent years telling people the only person you should believe is him. And there's a good portion of the population who believes that he's the only one who's actually telling the truth, and he's the only one they can count on for an actual factual presentation. Of course, it's quite the opposite. So traditional media just doesn't have the impact that it once did because of the fragmented nature of media, because of the internet, because people can go to any outlet that affirms their pre-existing point of view. And then you have major ones, Fox News being a classic, you know, the most notable of those, which repeatedly lied about the results of that election. And this has been documented, and of course they ended up having to pay a $787 million defamation settlement because they consistently lied about it and lied that these Dominion voting systems and Smartmatic, that they somehow manipulated the results of the election, and all sorts of other conspiracy theories. So that has a huge impact. I mean, people on the right believe Fox News. They have high levels of trust among people on the right. And so they bought into that. And of course, Fox News did it because it was fearful of losing its audience to One American News Network and to Newsmax.
What do you all think would have happened, by the way, if Trump had been a different kind of politician and had said, okay, I accept it. If he had done what Al Gore did, because I agree, the existence of the Fox Newses of the world exacerbated it. But if Trump had said what Al Gore said, okay, I lost, I buy it. How would things have been different?
Country would have moved on, absolutely.
What did you say?
The country would have moved on.
Completely.
And even the far right press that sort of has given him comfort, would that not have happened? I think it wouldn't have happened.
I don't
wouldn't
think
have
it
happened.
would. No, I don't think
I
it would
agree.
have, because I think so
wouldn't
much of
have.
this, to Marty's point, I mean, this was not just about what happened in the election and what Trump said after. It was about laying the groundwork
Right.
in the lead up to it. So I think his supporters and also the supportive media were primed for that moment. So it became this natural place for them to go. And I think if he had led them in a different direction, I don't
100%.
think we would have seen them pushing.
And not only
conversely,
that.
if Al Gore had said, I refuse to accept it, I won, this was a conspiracy, I don't care what the Miami Herald, the New York Times, and everybody else found, I won. Don't you think something similar would have happened, that there would have been corners of the left-wing press that would have sort of given him comfort? There wouldn't have been a Fox News.
Well, there's still
No,
corners
guys,
of the...
Even Fox didn't believe it. Hello? They didn't believe it. They knew that Trump had lost in 2020. Even Fox News, that's the point
Right.
of their lawsuit.
Absolutely.
Right.
So
That's right.
we're asking ourselves, would we have lied like that? They did,
Right. No,
knowingly. So I
getting
think
at-
no, frankly.
I was getting, the reason I asked the question is because embedded in Dick's earlier question is, does this say more about the press or does it say more about politics? And I think I would read the answers you all gave as saying that it says more about politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I do think something would, I mean, you can gauge from the reaction in the crowd that if Al Gore had said, I won, I refuse to accept it, it was stolen from me.
Yeah, he certainly would have been lighting tinder since 20 years later.
Right.
There's still a fair amount of tinder.
But if I'm not mistaken, and I may be mistaken because I wasn't covering American news at that time, but Trump laid the groundwork all the way until the election day for this result, for how he would challenge the
Right.
result.
Well,
Al Gore at no point.
Yes, when in fairness to historical accuracy, he laid the ground before he won, the time before he won.
Right.
Right. I mean, he said that election was going to be stolen, and
Right.
couldn't even quite get over it until a
So
few
maybe-
days afterwards.
So that's the answer.
Well, he
I wanna-
he even said he won the 2016 election. He said that was rigged too, by the
Right.
way. So that he
I
won the popular vote.
I want to
That
move
was
on to
rigged.
something else uncontroversial.
We're here to discuss uncontroversial.
It's definitely not controversial. That's
in
why
these-
it doesn't
this-
get dealt with, because we treat it as if it's controversial, and we treat it as if telling the truth is somehow radical.
Right. But, I meant by a controversial subject. And so, in these historical pairings, the next question, Christiane, is for you. Talk about the differences in your reflection between covering the wars in Bosnia and Gaza.
Well, look, I am a little bit obsessed because I'm very concerned about the power of disinformation and such professional disinformation as comes out of Russia, for instance. They are masters of the game. They make us look like amateurs. They have been doing this for decades. It's documented. Just recently, the Washington Post documented, all the fake and disinformation that they are sending to the Congress to change the thing on arming Ukraine and stuff like that. They're exceptionally sophisticated. And the reason why I start by saying that is that that's dangerous now, and it was dangerous when I started covering Bosnia. In Bosnia, it was a mini version of what's happening in Ukraine right now. In Bosnia, you had a mini Putin by the name of Slobodan Milosevic, but whose methodology was exactly the same. It was ethnic cleansing, it was demonizing and targeting, in this case, an ethnic group in another republic, in order to carve out land. That was the principle. Nothing else. It was just to steal land and create a greater Serbia. Here, it's Putin trying to create a greater Russia, using exactly the same tactics and strategy, but with much bigger weapons and much more consequential global fallout, because it will completely and utterly define the way we live if he wins in Ukraine. And that's the difference.
But what I was wondering about contrasting the coverage of the wars in Bosnia and Gaza.
Well, Gaza, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say Gaza. Well, there are two differences. Number one, in Bosnia, and it's the same for all the newspapers and for many of the networks at that time, this was front page news for 4 years. We actually covered this in a way that affected global politics and reacted to the humanitarian catastrophe that was happening. Right now, the war first the attack on Israel, and now the counteroffensive into Gaza, is not just a story, but there's a whole nother level, which is politics, which is very difficult because it makes people have to think twice, 3 times, and 4 times about how you say something, how you call something, what you say. It is changing as the world sees the results of the counteroffensive. The debate around it, the coverage of it is changing because it's reflecting the accuracy of what's going on right now. But it is incredibly difficult, and I think we'll all agree, we are not allowed to enter Gaza. Journalists, even Israeli journalists, are not allowed to enter Gaza unless they are handheld by the IDF. And then they go in for a couple of hours here and a couple of hours there, and they come out with a highly controlled, it's an embed, but it's only one tiny, weeny sliver of what's going on. That is a major problem. In addition, 95 journalists have been killed because they are part of the civilian population in Gaza. They're not us. They are local Gazans who are risking their lives, their families, and their livelihoods to try to tell us the stories on their iPhones, on their cameras, and they are losing their lives. So we are not getting the full story, and I think that's really a shame. And I have never, in the 34 years that I've been doing foreign news, I have never known a democracy to prevent you from going and telling the story. I've just never known it.
And how do you think the coverage would change if there were free?
Massively.
And in what ways?
Massively. First and foremost, I think it would have a controlling effect on what was going on in the field. I do believe that, having seen the way, the ideas and the politics around Bosnia changed. Took a while, but we're in an exponentially faster world right now with social media. Everything is much faster in terms of political reaction to what's going on than it was in Bosnia. So I do believe that it would have an impact. I can't exactly tell you how, but I think it would have a salutary impact if we were there much
Julie.
more.
I just do want to just quickly, though, give a shout out to the Palestinian journalists who have been covering the story.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
They are incredible. We have had a team, it's a very small number of international news organizations that have had a permanent presence in Gaza for many years. The AP, Reuters, BBC, AFP, a few others have had smaller presences there. And the dedication of our team to covering this story while they are living through it, and to do it in a remarkably independent and fact-based way, given again that they are living
100%.
through it and under significant pressure from multiple sides. They are deserving of all the credit that I hope that they get.
But imagine the two. Was it your two or was it Reuters who won the award?
Reuters today.
Okay.
Yeah.
They couldn't leave Gaza. Why? Probably because it's difficult to get out, but probably because they knew they wouldn't be allowed back.
Next pairing, Dean, I'd like to hear, this is a little less controversial, although maybe even just as depressing. I'd love to hear your thoughts comparing covering local government in the 1980s, which you did with great distinction in both New Orleans and Chicago, with covering local government today, which, as we said before, is a big part of your continuing work at the Times.
It's remarkably different. As part of the program that I run, where we work closely with local news organizations around the country, I spent a week as I was preparing to think about it, I spent a week in Jackson, Mississippi. And I visited every news organization in Jackson. And I spent a day at the Jackson Clarion Ledger, which when I was growing up in New Orleans was a giant newsroom. And we did an all-hands meeting. I think there were 20. Mississippi Today, which is sort of the new sort of very good startup, probably has 25. And they can't possibly cover the stuff we covered. When I was at the Times-Picayune, at its peak, we had newsrooms of 500-600 people. We covered every parish school board, every police jury. They can't do that. It's absolutely impossible. And that's the other thing they can't do, they can't take risks. It's hard to say, if you work in a 20-person newsroom, I have a tip and I want to spend 6 months on it, and it might not fly. We did that all the time in 500-person newsrooms. So they can't, that means investigative reporting in those newsrooms is really, really difficult to do. Their editors are overwhelmed. I say this, by the way, with admiration, even for the Alden and Gannett newsrooms, because I'm not talking about their owners, I'm talking about their journalists in their newsroom. They don't have time to take risks. They don't have, when we brought young journalists in for the fellowship program that I run, they're not used to taking trips. If those are like the small things you think about, right? So when I was a reporter at the Times-Picayune or the Chicago Tribune, I remember I had a tip when I was in Chicago that there was a guy in San Diego in a jail cell who could tell me stuff about the mayor of Chicago. I mentioned it to the Metro editor, and I was on a plane the next day. They've all grown up under constrained budgets with no travel. So it's pretty dim. But let me say what's cool, because it's very cool. Let's not kid ourselves. Not all those big newspapers were terrific. They just weren't. They were sometimes stifling. They were sometimes not open to women and people of color. They were, they did not cover their communities aggressively, even though they covered them widely. There are some really cool startups all over the country that are being run by young journalists who are entrepreneurial, ambitious, want to try stuff. ProPublica, which, as I've said before, is one of the great inventions of the digital era, that couldn't have existed. And they're helping all these news organizations with local news. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on, but the overall picture, I think, is pretty grim compared to the 1980s.
Julie, you joined AP, if I believe, as a video producer, right? And one of the first multimedia journalists at all of AP, as I understand it. So I'd appreciate you telling us about how you think multimedia journalism has changed over the last 2 decades.
Oh, gosh.
And what you see ahead for that.
It's really fascinating to think about. When I started at AP, I was 24, 25, and now the 24 and 25-year-olds that we are hiring. When I started, it was this really big deal. We've hired a multimedia journalist, and she's going to write, and she's going to do video, and she's going to work for digital. And it was like this very bizarre thing, and it took a lot of time for people to actually understand what that meant. It took a lot of time for me to understand what it meant, and we would talk about stories in ways that felt now so old-fashioned. Talking about multimedia, saying that term actually now feels so old-fashioned. When I think about the 24 and 25-year-olds who start now, they don't think about themselves as I'm a text reporter, or I'm a video reporter, or I'm a photographer, or I'm a multimedia reporter. I'm just a reporter. And the question that they ask is not, do I have text with it? Do I have photos? Do I have video? Which is the questions I would get asked. They ask themselves, what's the best way to tell this story? And whatever the best format is to tell the story is the way that we pursue the story. And they're driving it because they're just so close to the ways that people are consuming the news. And that's part of what makes me really excited, to be able to ask that question at the start, what's just the best way to tell this story? And then to be able to pursue it, whether it has text or video or photos. And one of the things that they've really, I think, been able to drive, certainly within our newsroom, which, I think sometimes people think about the AP as this like old school wire service. And, every day there's a really fabulous story that is maybe just a video or just a photo-led story, or maybe it's a gorgeous long-form narrative text piece, but it's all about what's the best way to tell the story. And I think, if we can, as journalists who are trying to run news organizations now, if we can encourage our staff, our journalists, our reporters and editors to be asking those questions, I think the results are going to be so much stronger than when I was plugging away.
I just, since we have the immediate past editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post sitting here, did young journalists think like that already at the New York Times and the Washington Post, or are they not quite at that point in your view?
Oh, yes, they do. They do. There are still levels of it. I mean, I think the New York Times, and I'm sure the same is true for the Post, goes into every story asking the question you said, which is the best way to tell the story. When we first started doing it, it would be, okay, we think the best way to tell this story is with a video, but we got to have a 4,000-word story with it. We don't do that anymore. There are still levels. I mean, video investigation still does something that I'm not sure most of the people in the newsroom could do, but I think that's true.
Marty?
Well, Dean works in this building, so maybe he needs to be more diplomatic. I'm currently unemployed and not, attached to any institution, so I can speak, I think, more bluntly. I think some do and some don't, and notwithstanding their age. So some people, they got in the field, they want to do long-form journalism. They want to do long magazine styles, big narratives, that sort of thing. And they have to be reminded that actually there's a better way to tell this story, or there are ways to supplement this story, or the story should be told in a very integrating all of the different tools that we have today, and use a video to tell something. It should be best tone with a video, and an audio to tell something, and then text in between. That was actually done quite recently in the New York Times very well with the thing about picking up trash here in the New York, done by Emily Badger, who used to work at the Post. I think that's some people are. Some people say they say, gee, this would make a great make a great audio. This would be a great video. But I think that, part of the job of the editors is to say, hey, we've got these teams, right. And a lot of the projects, or even not projects, but smaller pieces, you're pulling together a team. Now you're filling a room every time many times when you're embarking on a story, and there's a whole room of people there, assuming people go into the office. But it's a reason to go into the office, actually, so that you can actually exchange ideas and you can talk to people and get to know them and those sorts of things. And so, you have a video person, you have an audio person, you have a person who's great at interactive graphics, you have whatever, and you can talk about, well, what's the best way to really tell this story? And but not everybody who is sort of getting into the field necessarily has that orientation.
Since journalists revel in biting the hand that feeds them, in anticipation of this, I asked a number of journalists what I should be asking you all, and a couple of them, a couple of the old-timers I enormously respect said, well, if you're at a awards, something that's from an awards ceremony, would you please ask about awards? Which I thought was a fair point. So here's my question.
Table 47.
Journalism awards, on balance, helpful or a little bit less so to the advancement of journalism?
I would argue helpful. I would argue helpful because forget the New York Times and the Washington Post and the big news organizations, which win a lot of awards. I will tell you when local publications win an award, it's an inspiration that lifts the newsrooms. I also think that if you expect people to only want to do great, big, ambitious work to change the world, well, that's not the way most people operate. I mean, when I was a young reporter, I wanted to win an award, and I was driven by it. So are there downsides of awards? Yeah. I mean, every December in the New York Times, and probably the Post too, and AP, every December, and they ought to double the price of the paper in December because everybody's getting in their last end of the year awards, 4 big projects the same day. No, not always enough concern for the reader.
All of a sudden, people are able to make deadline at the
All
end
of a sudden, people are, that's right.
It's amazing. All year long, they haven't been able to make deadline.
That's
It comes December, they've made deadline
That's right.
all at the same time.
So that's the downside. But I think on balance, the upside, especially, again, it's a mistake to judge these things just by our news organizations. Man, if Mississippi Today, which won the Pulitzer last year, if Mississippi Today was partly wanted to win a prize to get some national attention, to help them raise money, to make people understand they existed, to capture an audience in Mississippi, that's fantastic. So I think on balance, good.
Other views?
Well, I'll say, I think on balance, they're good because they encourage people to do highly ambitious work that takes time to do. But I do think that there's a downside to awards as well, carving out a notable exception for the Polk Awards, of course. But I worry that I've always said it's a lot easier to win awards than it is to win readers. And we need to win readers. And I worry that sometimes people are thinking too much about the awards they're going to win rather than how we get more people to actually come to us and to trust us and to depend on us every day, throughout the day. And so I do think it has a good impact in that it encourages people to do very ambitious and necessary work and to dig and the kind of work that takes time, but it can also have an incredibly distorting effect on terms of how people spend their time and not thinking enough about what we need to do to get a bigger audience, what we need to do to get readers.
Christiane? Julie?
So I think it's great. Obviously the Pokes, and today I was reminded again by the incredible quality of journalism and diverse, investigative, and the foreign, and the photos, and the podcasts. It was just amazing to see in one space that quality of work again. I think I agree exactly with what they say about how it inspires the newsroom, but I would say also an extra level, in the foreign field, sometimes it can actually save lives. If somebody has won an award or the subject of somebody's story has won an award, they may be safer in their horribly dangerous environment than they might have been without the spotlight on them. And I also think, what Julie said about the entrepreneurial and the investigative, I was really, Carl Bernstein is there, you're all the quintessential investigative. ProPublica is one of the greatest things ever. It was recovered, it was recognized twice today. And I just think it is really exciting to see the investigative pieces that are still done. I know it's not as much as it used to be, but CNN Digital, we're often doing, really good investigations. And the more of that we can do, the better it is. But I think it is there, so it's wonderful.
I would say, in general, I'm never going to say, no to awards that celebrate amazing, entrepreneurial, ambitious journalism. The one thing I think about a lot when this kind of question comes up, though, is this conversation I had once with a reporter who worked for me, who was just the backbone of my newsroom, right? That reporter you called every time there was a big story that was breaking, where you just needed fast, clean, crisp writing that was going to just get that story in front of the audience. And I was having this conversation with this reporter, and they said to me, I'm just not really feeling like I'm making much progress. I'm really struggling. And in my mind, I was like, this is the person who I rely on. I said, why do you feel that way? And they said, do you know, I've never won an award. He literally said this to me, I've never won an award. I'm not an award-winning journalist. And it just broke my heart. It broke my heart because that was what was held up as the kind of the gold standard. And so, yes, we should award the best of journalism, whether it's local, state, national, foreign. But I think we also have to make sure that for the journalists who are out there really trying to be good public servants, really trying to inform audiences, really trying to draw audiences in, that they have to know that there is just as much, and probably, if we're being honest, more value in that than a long list of awards next to your name.
I think, by the way, I think there's some big gaps in the awards. I mean, so when the Pulitzers eliminated the beat reporting prize, I thought that was an incredible shame. I mean, I know some people who are the greatest beat reporters are on top of their beat. Every day they're informing people and providing insights in every story that they write. They have, over time, they've developed real great sources. But that kind of reporting is not recognized today. And that is a real shame because we actually need a lot more of that reporting.
Right. It feels almost obligatory these days when, yes. It feels almost obligatory these days when talking about journalism to speculate a bit. I only want to do it for a little bit about the impact on it of generative artificial intelligence. Anybody want to try their hand at that briefly?
On what aspect of it? I'm sorry.
What aspect?
Journalism generally?
Impact on journalism?
Yes.
Of AI.
Well, I can.
I mean, I'm generally an optimist at this point, a cautious optimist about it. I think that, every time you have a major kind of technological innovation, there's that moment of panic. And I think we all spent a lot of last year in kind of that panic mode. And I think probably in a lot of the newsrooms that many of you are in or that we're in, the panic has sort of moved to the practical, which is, okay, this technology exists. It's not going to go away. What are the potential use cases for it? And I think there are a couple of different buckets of it. There are the use cases that are honestly not that sexy, right? Translation, summarization, personalization, just being able to speed that up, being able to have kind of more volume there. That is generative AI, and that will be very valuable to our ability to create more content and free up human journalists to do things that are, I think, of higher value. Then there are use cases for journalism that I think also will have the same ultimate effect, but are a little bit more exciting. And I don't want to talk too much about what we're experimenting with in the background there, but I think they're really exciting. And then, of course, there is the scary bucket. And I think so much of kind of what happens in that bucket is going to come down to the people who run newsrooms, who own news organizations, and what they decide to do with that technology. I mean, I think you can see, based on the way the technology is moving, it's not there yet, but it is getting pretty good. And sure, I think there will be moments when you could say, I could replace a human journalist with this technology, and that's going to be almost an ethical decision, and if we're being honest, probably a financial decision, and how the people who run those newsrooms and own those news organizations decide, what they decide to do there, I think will really make the difference between whether this is a net positive or negative for the industry.
I think,
Yeah.
I think the last time a new technology came along, we panicked, we got defensive, we waited for it to die, and it ate us alive, which was the internet. So I don't think we should do that again. I think I think, of course, there are perils, but I've also already seen some stuff. I mean, I was in a meeting with Cal Matters, where they're working on a program to essentially get every piece of legislation collected, and to use artificial intelligence to sort of find anomalies in legislation, to find the guy from Fresno who's proposing a bill in Malibu inexplicably. So I think we should be wary, but I also think if we don't jump in, embrace it, and figure out how to take advantage of it, bad stuff will happen. So I'm with Julie.
If you feel compelled, fine, otherwise.
I'm not compelled, but, so go ahead.
Last question from me, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. We have a number of students here today, so especially for them, I'd like to ask each of you to briefly recall a particular piece of journalism you remember from when you were young that helped propel you into this work.
By us or by anybody?
No, by anybody. No, not one that somebody else's journalism that inspired you.
I remember as a young reporter reading a book by Selwyn Rabb, who was the New York Times. I was a kid in New Orleans, so I don't think I'd ever read the New York Times. You couldn't get the New York Times except at the library days later. Selwyn Rabb wrote a book about a series of murders in New York. They were called the Career Girl murders. And it was beautifully crafted. The first half of the book was a portrait of the guy who was convicted as the killer. And then all of a sudden it was about the lives of the women and this guy and the way the police portrayed him. And then boom, in the middle of the book, he shifted gears and he told you what really happened, which is that the guy was railroaded. And I remember thinking it showed the possibilities of investigative reporting, storytelling. It raised, for me as a guy who ended up covering cops, it raised the possibility of digging hard into cops. I thought, and years later when I came to the New York Times as a young investigative reporter in 1990, I was able to go up to Selwyn, who was still on the Metro staff, to tell him that book had inspired me. It meant it was terrific.
That's excellent. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, since you pointed out my age at the beginning of this panel,
Actually, I didn't.
well, you alluded to it.
It was the Peloponnesian Wars, right? That was
A distinction without a difference is one right there. But I grew up during Watergate, so obviously every day I was reading those stories, and so I was reading Woodward and Bernstein, honored today, and not to date them, but and they were having a tremendous impact, obviously, and I was following what was happening with Watergate and that, and the other investigative reporting that was going on at that time. So that, was inspiring as well as to what, it sort of sent the message of holding power to account and the role that journalism, the central role that has for journalism.
I remember I was living in Iran, and I was not yet sure what I wanted to do with my life. And two very prominent women took my attention. One was Oriana Fallaci, the great Italian journalist who was fearless in the field and was also a really controversial interviewer. And then, frankly, Barbara Walters, but not necessarily for her celebrity interviews. Remember, I was living in Iran, and we did get news of, for instance, this unbelievable exclusive in 1979 with Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat around the Camp David. And I was completely swept away by that. I was a bit younger when Woodward and Bernstein were doing Watergate, but I can tell you that I heard a lot about it because even in Iran, all my family's friends were very pro-Nixon because he had a decent relationship with Iran. And they were all very concerned about what was going to happen. And then, why are these people writing all this stuff about Nixon? And it was really interesting. I mean, it was really interesting because I had no idea about journalism or anything at that time. So Woodward and Bernstein were in my consciousness, but my influencers were slightly later, Barbara Walters and Oriana Fallaci.
Carl, you probably did not worry about what you were doing to the shop, but
I think it's so interesting that one of the commonalities in what everyone has said and what I think about too is that it's journalism and it's journalists, kind of individual journalists, because I remember not one story, but a moment actually. I was in college, I was a journalism student, and it was September 11th. And I remember my roommate in college I was asleep still, because I was in college, and my roommate had the TV on, and I heard Tom Brokaw's voice. And I remember thinking, literally the first thing I thought was, why is Tom Brokaw on TV in the morning? Because he hosted the evening news. And I woke up and looked at the television and saw everything that was happening. And then we spent the next, like so many people, the next 12 hours kind of glued to the television, watching these reporters, and people kind of experiencing what was happening. But it was that like connection with the journalist who was telling you what was happening and that trust that you had in them. And I think so much of that, because of everything that's happened, has really faded away. And again, to be hopefully an optimist, I think about again the power and the resonance that we as journalists have with people, and think about our jobs through that prism. Hopefully it allows us to do some good and powerful work going forward.
excellent. Let's take questions from the audience. How are we doing this in terms of microphones? What's the answer? Oh, there are folks with microphones. Okay, so they will bring them to you. Yes, over here.
Coming down.
Thank you for doing this. I think you're highly overly optimistic about the future of generative AI and its potential impact on news. And I would like to challenge you to imagine, at the pace at which AI has already been developing, now leap your brain forward 5 years. We'll have they'll figure out how to do hands and faces so that you can't tell. And now imagine an incident happening in some remote place, supposedly, where some, head of state has suddenly disappeared, or a whole town has been blown up by some evil something or other, and it's all been generated, and it's all been deliberately released in pulses and in time signatures and so on. Would you have the capacity to know it wasn't true?
Yeah.
Would you even be able to see it? And how much damage would happen to the realpolitik before, so-called mainstream media figures out they're looking at a gigantic deliberate lie?
Yeah, I wasn't compelled before, but I am compelled now. So,
Good.
I think that generative AI offers all sorts of tools that we should take advantage of, but the great risk is what you're talking about. So people will be able to produce totally fabricated videos, totally fabricated audios, totally fabricated still images, and it will be very, very difficult to tell whether they are real or fake. There are companies now that are developing some tools for that, but they're highly imperfect, and there will be ways around that. And worse than that, there will be verified videos, verified still images, verified audio, which, if damaging to a politician or a business person or what have you, they will say that those are fake. And so the consequence will be that the public, and it's already difficult. I talked right at the beginning about how share a common set of facts, and we can't even agree on how to establish that something is a fact. That will be infinitely worse. The public will not be able to tell what is true and what is fake. And we in the media need to start thinking about how do we respond to that. We need to do it now. It's already too late, frankly, because we're going to see a lot. We've already seen some in this election, but we're going to see a lot, guaranteed, in October. So we need to develop some infrastructure in our business where there's a lot of collaboration between all sorts of media organizations, big and small together, with specialists in the field who have the tools, and that we can respond quickly because a fake image will be disseminated around the world, instantaneously reaching tens of millions of people, and people will react to it. And we are not equipped today to really respond to that. And we need to start developing the infrastructure for responding to that. We need to get over our competitive instincts when it comes to this and work together. I think AP, given that it's owned by all of us anyway, should be transparent about what it's working on, but we're all members, all you guys are members of the co-op, you know, but setting that aside. But in any event, AP
We look forward to sharing it with members of the co-op.
I'm not a member anymore, but the AP could lead the effort, frankly. Others could lead the effort to create a true network where we respond very, very quickly, working with specialists in universities who are not accustomed to working fast, but also working with all sorts of news organizations. You know, working with a lot of the regional ones and local ones and community ones, and having us all work together, because I don't think our competition is going to serve us well when it comes to this kind of problem.
Let me just say on this quickly, though. I mean, some of this is happening now, which is what makes me optimistic. To Dean's point earlier, I don't think we're sort of sitting on the sidelines waiting for this to wash over us. I mean, some examples of this are there's a really terrific group of news organizations working exactly on image verification right now, working with each other, but also working with the technology platforms, because I think, you know, we also have to be honest. There's what media can do, but we can't do this alone, right? We're going to need technology partners. We're going to need government regulations to be able to get across some of this. So we have to be assertive and aggressive, but we also have to be driving and pulling others into the conversation. And then one of the other things that, you know, we are really leading on right now is training down in these local newsrooms. Because look, I'm fairly confident that the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and the AP will have technology and tools and teams across this. But in a local newsroom where you don't have somebody covering the mayor, you definitely don't have somebody who can verify an image. So we are in local newsrooms right now. We are giving them technology. We are helping them in real time, but also helping them try to build this infrastructure, because I think that's where this could be, you know, more problematic than even at that kind of national, international level where you're talking about.
I would just say that government is a huge player. Here it's delinquent, it's derelict in the United States. In Europe, it does do more to try to control whether it's social media or whether it's AI. But I would also say, to your point, and we saw it in Bosnia, this idea of saying, okay, enough already. We're not going to compete on this stuff. We are going to collaborate. We saw it in Bosnia in a different way. All of us in the field, mostly the picture, you know, the TVs and people who chase the most dangerous thing, we all collaborated and we made this thing called the Sarajevo Agency Pool, which involved not just the agencies, but all the networks who were there. We all shared the video of the sort of stuff that we all went to. So why do we all go to where a shell has gone? Or why do we all go to a press conference? We obviously did our own enterprise stories, but we really cut down on a lot of danger by cooperating. And so there is precedent, and it's very, very important.
The only thing was, I don't think you heard anybody being sanguine or casual about the possibilities. I think what you heard was, if all we do is panic, which is frankly what happened when the internet came. I was in, you know, 2 different newsrooms, and it was absolute panic. If that's all, and we were too slow in trying to figure out how to take advantage of it. We were too slow in understanding the possibilities. All we did was panic. What you heard me say, at least, was, if that's all we do, we're going to lose. It's going to happen anyway. We'll lose it. And my argument is just that we have to be a big part of it. That we just can't, like, throw up our hands and say, oh my God, this thing is happening, let's just stop it. Because we're not going to be able to stop it. We're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it and grapple with it, and in some cases take advantage of it.
Next question.
I would like to go back to the Bush versus Gore controversy, because I remember it differently, and then I looked it up in the New York Times, and it was a very slim margin either way. And it depends how the votes were counted, so how many hanging chads were really accepted and so on. And it said in the last big time story about it, looking at a broader group of rejected ballots, which were 175,000, found that Mr. Gore might have won if the courts had ordered a full statewide recount of all the rejected ballots.
Well, rejected ballot. I mean, this is.
Yes, but I feel like more 50-50.
No, well, no, it's not 50-50. So, I mean, rejected ballots, like in Duval County around Jacksonville, a lot of people, the Democrats did a really good job of getting people to vote, but they didn't train them on how to actually vote. So a lot of people would they'd scribble this, or they'd cross this out, they would do this sort of thing. In Palm Beach County, you may recall, there was the butterfly ballot, and a lot of people voted for, what's his name? Pat Buchanan, when they meant to vote for Al Gore because it was really confusing. Well, the Democrats had the opportunity to review those ballots before they were used. So you can look at it in all sorts of different ways, but when you actually look at the ballots that would have been used as part of a recount, George W. Bush most likely would have won. You can't be sure because these chads, they're coming off, they're like little things, right? The more you use them, things will start dropping off or what have you. So, but in a recount, it probably would have ended up that way.
Yes.
But it's very
There's
slim.
somebody, yes, there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. My fingers are tired from typing, which is good. So my question is about democracy in the digital age, right? So we're framing, not we, but in general, I'm here. We're framing Trump. Trump is a disaster for democracy. But at the same time, there's a parallel universe where AI can also be a disaster for democracy. And I don't quite see that level of what are we going to do, right? So I'm thinking about the tension of being proactive and reactive. So what are the protocols that are in place or could be in place, or we could advocate from executive order from Biden administration on down, and then also in your newsrooms for when, as you said, in October or tomorrow, right, where there is a firestorm of fake news. There is something that is questionable that people go, oh, I don't know, breaking news, and then it's not. Like, what is the rapid response to diffuse that? And I'm also going to be talking for the Center for Communication on Monday around artificial intelligence, and I'm also doing a town hall at Columbia University on April 23rd about these topics, about the impact of AI in our humanity and our sanity. So yeah, just want to know what are the protocols, what are the policies?
Well, I can tell you I don't know. And I'm going to make it my business to find out, because it's a very good question. You know, you raised this question. We've all been talking about it. We know that there was an issue. What was it? The fake voice of Biden in the New Hampshire primary. Then there was a fake image of, I think it was an attack on the Pentagon. I can't remember. It was something that I can't remember exactly, but there was some fake image a few weeks or months ago that actually moved markets for a second. Yes, until people figured out that it wasn't correct. So I don't know what was the way we figured out that it wasn't right, and I don't know what the protocols are in our organization, but it's a very good question, and we should all be involved in figuring this out, because the truth of the matter is technology is not going to voluntarily take a back seat, but we really did fail. Governments failed, the industry failed, the private enterprise tech people failed to regulate social media, and we're in deep doo-doo because of that. And that's an example. You know, it really has harmed us, social media. It's really an exponential, tsunami of disinformation and mental health problems and just everything that you just don't want to have to deal with. And it's because I think the whole body politic, everybody, all the constituents, were much too slow in trying to get it regulated.
Julie, since you're actually still running a newsroom, what protocols do you all have in place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say we spent a lot of time talking about this, particularly I can talk about this in the context of the election, and perhaps our particularly unique role at the AP. We count the vote, we call the races, and so we talk a lot about what happens if we call a race, but there's another race call floating around, for example. I will also tell you, it doesn't take generative AI to do that. Every election that I have been involved in since social media has existed, at some point during the night, some AP Race Call Twitter account pops up that's not ours, and race calls start shooting out, and we've got to go in and get across that and get the platforms to take it down and work with our teams and our members to try to get the real information out there. So in some ways we have some practice, but I think this is particularly concerning because of the formats and the speed at which this could travel. So on our end, one of the benefits of having a primary season that has been wrapped up pretty quickly is it's allowed us to do a lot of our tabletop exercises, a lot of our rehearsals. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how much time we spend practicing for what election night and election week, if it's that again, will actually look like. Our project manager for elections, she'll kill me for saying this, but she just sent around her Confess Your Nightmares email where we all are confessing our nightmares, into the document. A lot of that revolves around AI, but I also remind people, we did that last time around, and one of the things that was not on our Confess Your Nightmares document was an insurrection on the US Capitol, right? I mean, I'm being serious about that. That was not on the list. So I think it's both that investing the time and the resources to do a lot of the scenario planning, but then also making sure that you are nimble and flexible enough to react to the things that none of us can think about in this room right now.
Practicing for a generative
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I think we are out of time. I want to thank all of you and the panelists for what I hope was an interesting session. Thank you. Are we adjourned, Ralph, or do you?
Yes, I mean, because we started a little late, we did so because of screening and setting up. We have time for a couple, maybe two more questions.
Oh, great. Well, there was a young man over here
It's mine.
who's got his hand up. If somebody can get him a microphone. There we go. I'm sorry. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this great panel. And so I'm in college, and I have brothers who are younger, and we spend a lot of time reading the news during COVID and during lockdown. And I'm just curious what your organizations are doing. I mean, in the midst of all this AI stuff, and you talked about social media as being a big danger, but it's also a major way to reach younger audiences who this is the main way they consume news. Like, my school gives us the New York Times for free, and I have to keep telling my friends that we have it for free because they don't use it, because that's not how they get the news now. So I'm just curious what your organizations are doing to be better about reaching younger audiences.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot. So one of my crowning accomplishments as executive editor has been being the face of AP's first TikTok. And I realized when that happened, though, this was the moment that I realized, I thought they asked me to do it because I was kind of, young and cool, and I realized, no, it was ironic because I was old on TikTok. So, but no, we're on TikTok. We are trying to be, talking about being nimble. Social media right now is a little bit of like whack-a-mole, right? So, if you look at where Facebook was a couple years ago and where it is now for news, or Twitter, which is now X, or evolutions on Instagram, or, now we're experimenting with WhatsApp, or LinkedIn is a really important social platform for a lot of people to get their news. So we start every month sort of assessing where we are on the various social platforms to try to gauge which audiences are reacting to which stories in what places. And it sometimes can feel like whack-a-mole because something that was working 2 months ago, isn't working there. I think one of the challenges right now for the news industry in this space is that the audiences are in these places, but these platforms are not helping our business models. TikTok, for example, has a massive audience, and there's no revenue back to news organizations from having a presence on TikTok. It's good for our brand, it's good for our ability to spread information, but it doesn't help our business model. And I think that's where, again, I wish we had more control over this, but this is really a conversation for the platforms, and we've just seen them over the last several months and years really deprioritize news.
So we also have obviously a mission at CNN to try to get younger viewers, users, all the people who engage with us, because generally television is slightly skews older. So also we do TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, but there is TikTok. The only thing that concerns me and I've certainly seen it during this war, is that there's so much activism on TikTok that masquerades as journalism that it's a problem. It's just a problem. And there's so many people who actually have never actually been there telling us what we should think, what we should say, what position we should take. And that's kind of really overwhelming quite a lot of the TikTok, social media, whatever space. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place, because yes, we want to attract and obviously be useful for people like you and your age, but it's a really difficult question how to do it in a way that's also, matches journalistic principles.
Marty and Dean, or should I go to the? No, yours. Okay, well, I think the real last question is up here. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I have a question as a former TV reporter, but it might be applicable to print newsrooms as well. Lately, I've heard a lot of talk from newsroom managers about the struggle of recruitment and retainment of reporters. And, we TV reporters entering our 30s and 40s are, quite frankly, growing increasingly jaded with the industry and leaving to public relations and communications and giving up on our dreams of giving a voice to the voiceless. What advice would you have for these jaded journalists?
Why are you jaded?
Well, quite frankly, in the name of multimedia journalism, we are being task-loaded with having to do the camera work, having to set up the live shot, having to edit, and our pays are not increasing.
If I could, there are some parallels in print. I would say, frankly, I think for a young journalist, David Remnick said it in his remarks, and I think he's right. I don't want to kid anybody. It's harder. There's more stuff you have to do. Newsrooms that have gone from 600 to 20 in the world that I live in. There's no way people are not working harder. On the other hand, and I'm addressing the jaded part, on the other hand, you can have more impact in journalism than you could when I was in my 20s. I meet, journalists who work for modest-sized nonprofits, in newsrooms of 5 or 6 that work really, really hard, but have tremendous impact in their communities. I have met publishers who are 25. I have met, reporters and editors who have, figured out ways to cover slices of communities. I don't want to be Pollyannish about all of the problems in the industry. We've talked about them, but I would say that your generation, and I'm speaking for what used to be print. I think your generation is going to get to reinvent journalism because technology is going to give you tools that we didn't have. And I think that I'm not sure this is a time to be jaded, is what I would say.
I would just say, almost everybody I know in journalism, and I suspect the panel would all agree, and you saw this in the awards today, the awards from this past year, including the student who won one of them, and a student won a Pulitzer last year, or won a Polk last year as well. The best journalism that's being done today, I think, is the best journalism that has ever been done.
Totally. Yeah.
And the business is in trouble, but the work is not.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all again very much.
I don't know, just one brief message, primarily for previous Polk winners. We are going to start a new group called the George Polk Society, in which the only qualification for membership is having won a Polk Award. And we will ask you, when you go back to your hometowns, to become nominators, to keep an eye out for the best journalism that you can find, especially in out-of-the-way places and unusual platforms. We'll be in touch with you and ask you to enlist, no obligation, no rules, no conflicts. It's a perfect organization for journalists. And now please join us at the wine reception. It's free. And thank the panel for a great discussion.